two tables. It's called a natural join and it's easier to code, but it's not something that I recommend because sometimes it produces unexpected results. But let me quickly show you how it works in case you see it somewhere, so at least you're familiar with it. So back to the previous example, let's select everything from the orders table. Now we should do a natural join with the customers table. Now with these natural joins, we don't explicitly specify the column names. So the database engine will look at these two tables and it will join them based on the common columns, the columns that have the same name. And that is the reason this query is shorter to write. So for clarity, let's pick a couple of columns here, O.order ID and C. Let's say first name. Let's execute the query. There you go. So we see all the orders and the customers who placed them. So natural joins are really easy to code, but they can be a little bit dangerous because we're letting the database engine figure out or guess the join. We don't have control over it. For this very reason, natural joins can produce unexpected results, and that's why I discourage you to use them. In this tutorial, you're going to learn how to insert a row into a table. For that, we're going to use the insert into statement. Where are we going to insert this row? Into the customers table. So we type out the name of the table here, followed by the values clause. And here in parentheses, we supply the values for every column in this table. So back to our table definition, these are all the columns. First, we need to supply a value for the customer ID column. However, in this column, the auto increment attribute is enabled. And as I told you before, if we don't supply a value, MySQL will generate a unique value for us. So we can go back to our statement and either assign an explicit value or use default to let MySQL take care of generating this value. And this is the preferred approach. Because if you use an explicit value like 200, it is possible that you might have another customer with the same ID. So when you execute this statement, you're going to get an error because you cannot have duplicate values in this column. Every value should be unique. So here we're going to use the default keyword to let MySQL generate a unique value for the customer ID. Now after that, we need to supply a value for the first name and last name columns. So let's say John Smith. Note that I have enclosed these values with quotes because as I told you before, in SQL, we should always enclose string and date values with quotes, either single or double quotes, okay? Now, what else? Back to our customers table. After the last name, we have the birth date. However, as you can see, this column is optional because this checkbox is not checked. So here we can use null or an explicit value. Null means the absence of a value. So back to our statement, we can type out a birth date like 1990, January 1st, or we could use the null keyword to leave out this value. Now in this demo, I'm going to use a valid date. Now to make this code cleaner and more readable, I'm going to break it up into multiple lines. That's better. Now back to our table. Next we have phone, and phone is also optional because this checkbox is not checked, and null is the default value for this column. So here we can explicitly pass null or use the default keyword and let MySQL put null into this column. It's exactly the same. So back to our statement, we can pass null or default. Both these keywords will have the same result. In this case, I'm going to use the null keyword. All right, let's have one more look at our table. Next, we have 4 more columns that are required. So address, city, state, and points. And note that points has the default value of 0. So we can either use an explicit value like 200 or use the default keyword and let MySQL generate 0. So back to our statement. Let's type out an address. It doesn't really matter. Followed by a city and a state, let's say California. And finally, points. Again, we can use an explicit value or default. So this is how we can insert a row into a table. However, in this example, we are only supplying values for first name, last name, birth date, and these address fields. So we're leaving out the phone number, the customer ID, and the points. So there's another way to write this statement. Let me show you. So after the table name, we can optionally supply the list of columns that we want to insert values into. In this case, first name, last name, birth date. Now, once again, I'm going to break up this statement into multiple lines. So 3 more columns: address, city, and state. So these are the 6 columns that we're going to supply values for. With this change, we don't have to use these default or null values. We only supply values for these columns. So I'm going to remove default from here, then null, and finally this last default keyword. So these 6 values that we supplied here are used for these 6 columns. Now with this change, we can also reorder the columns. We don't have to list them in the same order that they are defined in the customers table. For example, we can put the last name first, and then obviously we should also swap the order of these values, so we can list them in any orders. Now let's execute this statement. Now if you look at the output window, down the bottom, you should see the statement followed by 1 rows affected. Unfortunately, I cannot resize this window to show you this message, but if you look down below, you can see that 1 record was affected, which basically means 1 record was inserted into this table. Now let's look at the data in the customers table. So the last row is the one that we inserted. You can see that MySQL automatically generated the value 11. This is the effect of auto increment attribute. So it takes the value of the last row and increments it by 1. So here we have the first name, last name, the birth date. We didn't supply a value for the phone attribute, so that's why we have null here. We also have address, city, state, and the default value of 0 for the points.